So I would imagine that most of us have had the experience before of meeting somebody in person that we have looked up to or admired, respected, maybe followed for a while. And then there's so much that goes into that initial actual meeting of that person. Do they meet your expectations, fall short of? Hopefully they got a good night's sleep last night, There's a lot of weight to that. For me, I had a really good experience with that about a year and a half ago when I got to meet somebody that I've looked up to for a long time and read a lot of their work. And that is when I got to meet an author and speaker, among many other things, named Bob Goff. It was a really special moment getting to meet him because he was like everything that I pictured him to be. If you're not familiar with who Bob Goff is, he's basically like if the most interesting man in the world were also your sweet grandfather, and somehow that was like the same person, and lives just this adventurous life full of amazing stories, and he was that. He was a lot taller than I thought. He was like 6'4", 6'5", really lanky. I didn't expect that. He was warm, he was present, he was encouraging, he was asking us questions, and if you ever have read any of his works, it would make sense to you. He was about to fly to the Pacific to rescue his friend on a stranded boat, because it's just a Wednesday for Bob Goff, right? So it was like just crazy trying to, actually getting to meet him. He is probably best known for a series of 4 different New York Times bestsellers now, which he does write from a Christian perspective, but obviously has a much broader audience than that. And he calls himself a recovering lawyer. So he had a long career as a lawyer. He went to Uganda one year, and he said his heart was just shattered over what he experienced there. He quit his law career. He started a nonprofit called Love Does, where he has used that law background to rescue children in all kinds of different environments, human trafficking, victims of child slavery, and so on. And he's now dedicated his life to these different kinds of stories. And as I read his books, they're always inspiring to so many people, because the way that he writes is he basically tells a short story from his life, and then there's some application point. And I think I resonate with it because that's largely the way that Jesus would teach. He would share a parable, and then he would make a point as a result. And in one chapter, you're like traveling around the world. He's talking about fighting witch doctors in Uganda or being shot at by terrorists in the Middle East. And then the next chapter, he's talking about his neighbor directly across the street. And he just bounces back and forth between these kinds of stories. In fact, one of the ones that was most memorable for me from his first book, Love Does, was towards the end of the book, and he's talking about a conversation he had with his children. And it's shortly after 9/11, and he's talking about the implications of that, the divided world that we're living in. He's asking his young kids, what would you do if you could sit down and you could talk to the leaders of our world? And his 7-year-old talks first and says, I would invite the leaders of the world over our house for a sleepover. That was the first reaction. His 10-year-old says, that's a good idea, but I think they're all a little bit too busy for that. I think we should go to their house and have a sleepover at their house. His eldest daughter then says, okay, I like all of that, but really I think they just need to hear each other. So I think we should ask them about their hopes and dreams and share that with each other, because they probably just don't understand one another. So then Bob Goff does probably what every parent would do. I don't know. He gets on the CIA.gov website, and they write letters to every world leader, every president, prime minister, king, and queen, and so on, asking if they can share a meal together. They get hundreds of rejections, and they get 29 yeses. So Bob pulls his kids out of school for an extended period of time. They travel the world meeting with these world leaders. And at the end of each of these meals, he gives them a letter and a copy of their house key to their front door, and says, if you're ever in the States and you need a place to stay, feel free to come have a sleepover with us. And one of the princes that they met with took them up on that a few years later. Just these extravagant, mind-blowing, is that even responsible type story, right? And then you contrast that with something like early on in his second book, Everybody Always, where he talks about his neighbor across the street, Carol. And we meet Carol, and she is a widow who had this incredible impact on his children's life and loved them so well. And her story kind of picks up in Bob's book when she receives a cancer diagnosis. And that day, he goes and he buys a pair of walkie-talkies, and he goes to Carol's house, and he sets up the walkie-talkie in her room. And he says, I just want you to know if you need anything, or on the days that are just hard and overwhelming, if you just want somebody to talk to, I want you to have direct access to us. And so he gives her the walkie-talkie. One extended stay, unexpected stay in the hospital, he had the nurse kind of sneak the walkie-talkie into her room, and then he was in another room in the hospital, and they're talking over those same walkie-talkies. a little over a year before Carol ended up passing away, he and part of their annual neighborhood parade that he's been doing for about 25 years now. He started it 25 years ago. He said there were 8 people, so it's basically his immediate family. He said not much of a parade, but called it that. Now they do this New Year's parade every year, and thousands of people come to be a part 25 years later. They push Carol around in her wheelchair, and they put a crown on her head, and she was Queen Carol for the day in the parade. And he said for the next year, people in grocery stores and seeing around the neighborhood, that's what they would call her. They would call her Your Majesty. That's how Carol was known. And then a few days before she passed away was New Year's again. So they rerouted the entire parade that year because she couldn't leave her home at this time. And they put her in front of her living room window to look out on the street. And a whole parade went by her door with different signs. We love you, Carol. We're for you, all of this. And then he ends her story in this artistic way that made me tear up as I read it, and the way only Bob Goff could. He said a few days later, the second parade of the week was thrown for Carol as she met Jesus. And when I read these stories, right, I share that for 2 reasons. One, Bob seems to both universalize and particularize, individualize neighbor, like across the world, across the planet, and his literal next door neighbor. I also share that with you because when I read his stories, maybe you've had a similar experience, there's some amount of skepticism that comes up in me. Like, can that even be real? Is that even responsible? Like, were you a trust fund kid? Like, how do you have the resources for all of this? And that ties into the story of the parable that I want to look at today. In that third kind of chapter of that book, when he shares Carol's story, he gives his explanation. He says this. He says, this is why I do what I do. We're not supposed to love only our neighbors, but Jesus thought we should start with them. I bet he knew if our love isn't going to work for the people who live close to us, then it's probably not going to work for the rest of the world. So that is the starting point. And what I want to ask is that unrealistic? Is that too simple? Could it really be Jesus' strategy of loving God and loving people? Could it be that loving your neighbor really can change the world? Or more specifically, our slice of the world, can it change your inner world? Is this just another religious activity on the list to love God and love people, or is it something that can transform us from the inside out? And I want to pause and I want to recap part 1 for just a moment because the 2 parts are so tied together. So whether you were here or not, this is a refresher because we're actually taking 2 weeks to look at one parable. Although last week you didn't really get into the parable, we just looked at the introduction to it. So I want to look at the kind of intro to this parable because we've said we are in the height of what is Camp 75 season here at Northpoint. You've heard about it multiple times already here today. And we wanted to share the why behind that love big, dream big tagline. We very specifically said that decades from now, I don't know if Camp 75 will be rebranded, if it'll be an entirely different strategy, what it would look like, but decades from now, we will be trying to do whatever we can obsessively to love God and love people, to love big and dream big, because that is foundational. That is the why behind which Camp 75 and any ministry or any event or any group at Northpoint would just be an outcome of the why that we're talking about these next 2 weeks. And so we said we want to do this series called Love Where You Live to talk about the foundational command of loving God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself, and talking about what does that look like in the context where we live. So we jumped into one of those. It's in 3 different Gospels where Jesus introduces this. We looked at Luke 10 last week, the setup to one of the more famous parables in the New Testament. And it started this way. We read, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, there's a lot happening here, but again, you can go back to part 1 if you want to recap it if you missed it. The fast version is that this is not an authentic question. We see he's trying to test Jesus, meaning it was basically like a politically charged question where the audience would have had their own opinion, and if Jesus answered it, he would have lost half of his followers. That's what the religious leaders trying to get to have happen here. But Jesus is way smarter than that, so he questions the questioner. He puts it back on this expert in the law, and he says, what's written in the law? How do you read it? You're the expert in it, and that's where the conversation should be. Anyways, what's written in the scriptures? What do you see? And to this man's credit, he had an answer ready to go. He combines a verse from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. That is foundational, that you cannot unlink the two. But if you're new to faith, you're exploring faith, you're trying to decide what it is that you believe about Jesus, hopefully this paints a North Star, a target for us. And if you've been following Jesus for a long time, hopefully this series serves as kind of a gut check to be like, am I doing the most foundational things that Jesus was so clear about before I try to move on to some of these more advanced things? And so Jesus affirms that. He's like, you're right. It was very clear. He affirms and he says, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. And unfortunately, the expert in the law misses what should have been kind of his next follow-up question because he wasn't asking authentically. What he would have realized that Jesus just did if he asked authentically is he would have realized Jesus just put an unattainable standard out there that nobody can love God perfectly all the time and nobody loves their neighbor perfectly all the time. Therefore, we all fall short of the law, of the standard, because that's all 613 laws summarized. And so we are in need of one who can fulfill all that. We're in need of a Savior. This should have gone to a gospel conversation, a grace conversation. And unfortunately, the leader, or the expert in the law, was asking with his own motives. And so he, in the next verse, talks about a question that might justify his position. He wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Put some parameters on it. How far do I actually have to go? And when I said I read some of those stories in those books and there's this skepticism in me, it's not because I actually think Bob Goff is lying or exaggerating. If I'm being honest, there's this part in me that wants an out, that wants to be like, that's not realistic. For somebody with responsibility and family and demands on our time, like we can't all go do that, right? That can't be what we're called to. I want an out. I want it to be simpler. I want to know that I'm already doing a good job and I don't have to change a whole lot about my life. That's some of what's coming in me when I read those kinds of stories. And as a result, I feel this kind of like pushback, or I'm trying to argue back. The leader of the law, the expert in the law, who had the first 5 books of the Old Testament memorized, is also looking for an out. And so we spent the rest of our time, we looked at a couple different verses last week, but just making some observations about that foundational idea or concept of love, because it's so confusing in our culture today. We use it for so many different things. And then we asked the kind of challenging question to say, is my increasing love for God increasing love for my neighbor? Because apparently for this expert in the law, it was not. For him, he wanted an out. And we asked that question to say, if my religious activity is increasing, but my love for neighbor is stagnant or declining, if my schedule is so full with these Christian things that I know all these Christian people, but as a result, I don't have time to love my neighbor well, we suggested, well, maybe it's not Jesus himself we're loving more at all. Maybe it's just the religious activity, the comfort, the control, whatever it is that we like. It's what's familiar. But the more we love the person of Jesus, the more our love for neighbor is going to increase as well. And that was the kind of challenge that we laid out last week. And this week, I would like to actually read the parable. I would like to actually look at the answer to this question of who is my neighbor? Why is it that he was trying to splice it up into these different categories and looking for an out? And Jesus does, in very traditional Jesus fashion, he tells a story. He tells a parable with a point and uses this kind of brilliant way to put in kind of full scope the perspective of who our neighbor is really supposed to be. So he starts it in verse 30, which is new from last week. He says, in reply, he said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Interestingly enough, there are some scholars who think this is an actual historical event that was being passed down via tradition because we know exactly where this was. We know a lot about the geographic region. Even if it is simply a parable, the point, of course, is the same. But we know a lot about this context. We know that there would be about an 18-mile gap in that journey between Jericho and Jerusalem. We know that it was about a 3,300-foot drop in elevation from one to the other. So really, wherever you're going from Jerusalem, you're going down as you're going down to Jericho. And we know it was an incredibly dangerous road as a result, that there weren't a lot of paths. And so by the time of Jesus, it was actually known as the Way of Blood because it was so violent and so unsafe. People would have known where Jesus was talking about. And the first kind of character after the man lying on the road that we're introduced to is a priest. He says a priest happened to be going down the same road. And when he saw the man, he passed by to the other side. Now, if you were here last week, I actually tried to challenge us to step back and identify with that expert in the law a little bit. Because I think sometimes when we're reading stories and we see the villain in the story, that villain becomes so unrelatable to us, we don't see ourselves in that person. And what happens is we miss an opportunity to kind of have a mirror reflected back on us. That we might have asked a very similar question to what that expert in the law asked. Similarly, this week, this priest is not just some unrelatable kind of stuck-up, selfish figure. I think this is something that many of us would have done as well, because his reasons for avoiding this man on the side of the road are likely understandable. Not justifiable, but understandable. And that's usually how we get ourselves in trouble. We do things that are not so blatantly, obviously wrong a lot of the times. We operate in the gray. And there's reasons. There's reasons why I don't have time to love my neighbor. I don't have the resources to love my neighbor. I've got other responsibilities. I have to make money for my family. My neighbor doesn't even want to talk to me, right? Like, we've got reasons, understandable reasons, why we would turn away from the need at hand. And the priest did as well. He would have just spent 2 weeks working in Jerusalem and would have been traveling back to Jericho with 2 weeks of pay. Not in cash, of course, or coin, but this would have been in foodstuffs and grain and animals. And as he's going back to his family with 2 weeks of work, he would have known that if he approached this man, there was a chance that his food, his 2 weeks of work could have been defiled based on Jewish law. And so he literally uses religious law as a justification to say, I'm going to look away and I have to go be with my family. Understandable. He's got priorities. There's a reason that he is looking away. And for us, we have our own list of justifications why we don't need to look at the needs of those around us, but it was not justifiable. This leader in the law did not have good reason to ignore the most foundational commandment of loving neighbor. But he walks on by. And then we're introduced to a Levite. A Levite in the next verse says, so too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. What Jesus is now doing is he's building some momentum that the crowd would have understood with context, right? Because there's basically this trifecta of leadership in the synagogue. So there would have been a priest at the top of leadership, and then a Levite would have carried out a lot of the logistical kind of administrative duties and functions. And then the third part would have been a lay person. And so the crowd's getting excited at this point, most likely, because they're like, oh, there's going to be a lay person that is coming next. That's just the average Joe. This is a relatable person. This is such a typical Jesus story to make the average Joe the hero, and they're probably getting a little bit excited. This is, if you're thinking about the analogy kind of this way, let's say like it's October, Red River rivalry is about to happen. We can't, for whatever, drive to Dallas. We're walking to Dallas. And Sarkisian goes first, the UT head coach, right? And he's got responsibilities. He's got the weight of a state on his shoulders. He needs to go prepare. And so he walks by the person in need. Quinn Ewers is next, our starting quarterback. He's got game plans, defenses to study. He's got to go. He walks on by. And then the crowd's getting excited because it's like, oh, it's going to be the water boy, or it's going to be a fan like you and I. This is going to be the hero of the story. And Jesus leans right in and says, but a Samaritan, not a lay person, which is the twist in the story. It's the aha, jaw-dropping, angering type moment for the crowd that we don't get necessarily just because we don't understand the full weight of the context. To keep the Red River rivalry thing going, this is kind of like saying, we're there, we're in the stadium, Jesus is in the end zone, the crowd is kind of getting rowdy, and he's like, Sark, he didn't have time. No, he didn't. Quinn Ewers doesn't have time. No. And they're like, it's going to be us. And he says, but a Sooner. Silence. A Sooner? Are they even civilized? Do they have electricity? Don't they date their cousins? Like, what? If you know the historical context, right, that's actually only helpful in us understanding the kind of three layers. If you know the history, you might even find that a little bit more offensive because it's too simple or it's too trite. Because what's actually laying here, it goes so deep. I mean, 700 years of context kind of leading up to this moment in illustration. When you look at 700 years before Jesus, this is how Israel is broken out between the northern and southern kingdoms. There is an animosity that has been building for centuries between these people because the Assyrians have invaded the north, the 10 tribes to the north, and then the 10 tribes ended up intermarrying and having children with the invaders, the conquerors, and their children are the Samaritans. And so the Jews to the south, a couple of tribes in the south, have this deep animosity. They see them as traitors. They see them as quite literally half-bloods that have messed up the pure bloodline from Abraham. And not only that, but they're changing their beliefs as a result because the Samaritans only see the first 5 books of the Old Testament as authoritative, not the whole thing. And so they would look at the Samaritans, the Jews in the south, and they would say, they are heretics. They are half-bloods. The Samaritans in the north would say the Jews, they are racist and they are cold. They are not an example of loving God and loving people. And for centuries, your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather would have hated whichever side was the opposite side from you. It is politically charged. It is racially charged, socially charged, religiously charged. Like all of these different pieces are in there. And so when Jesus doesn't say a Jewish layperson, but he says a Samaritan, it brought incredible clarity to the entire crowd. Everybody is turning internally, trying to think about the weight of this as he explains what the Samaritan did. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He had compassion. He had empathy for. He stepped into his world. He connected with, understood his immediate needs. He not only felt for him, but he also met his practical needs. And we get a whole long list of what that was and what that looks like. Look at the very next verse. It says, he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, which would have been expensive, covering his wounds first like he meets his immediate needs, making sure he survives this moment. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn and took care of him. Time he surely didn't have. He's just as busy as these other individuals that have already walked by. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, which is multiple days' wages, and gave them to the innkeeper. He wasn't concerned about losing his pay. He's like, whatever you need. Look after him, he said. And when I return, hey, I'm going to come back. I'm going so far above and beyond. I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. Whatever you need, this person's needs are first and foremost to me. Because love, according to the New Testament, is I'm going to prioritize your needs ahead of my own, even at great cost to me. And it's the Samaritan that was willing to do that. And Jesus, in his just brilliant way on multiple levels, responds with a question. He says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? It's brilliant because he just subtly changes the question. The question was, who is my neighbor? He says, which of these is, meaning it is an identity that you take on via action. It's something that you do, something that you become through loving others. And they also ask the question to make the guy have to say it. It's not just, I told you, you've processed it, you've been listening, so clearly, who do you think is the neighbor? But he couldn't. He couldn't even say sooner out loud. He couldn't say Samaritan out loud. The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy, the one who had compassion. For us, it's the group of people that bother you the most. It's the party that bothers you the most. It's the individual that when you see them, you hear about them, you hear a story about them, you see them post something, your stomach gets tight. It's like that's the person that was willing to lean in. And he's extending the definition of neighbor to that person. And what I love about this story is in a few quick sentences, Jesus both universalized and particularized neighbor. I feel like it's breaking some rules for a bottom line, like it should be easier to say or easier to remember, but I heard John Mark Comer, who's a pastor in Portland, speak on this, and he phrased it this way, and I just loved it. Because the point is, Jesus absolutely in this story expanded the definition of neighbor. It is all people to the ends of the earth. People who don't look like you, people who don't act like you, people who don't believe what you believe, that are a different political party, who have different values, the whole earth. But he did not minimize it either. Like at the same time, he's like, you can start ignoring those in immediate vicinity and start thinking about the whole planet. He also particularized neighbor. Your neighbor in particular, the one living next to you, living on your floor in your apartment complex. The people that you see in the gym each day, your office mates, your roommates, every single one of those individually are your neighbor. That it wasn't just metaphorical, something that we feel about the whole planet, but it was something that we embrace and own personally, literally. What if that's the thought exercise? What if we just had to ask ourselves, what if Jesus was being literal? That he means our literal neighbor, and we are to literally love them, do what is in their best interest regardless of the great cost to us. And he gives his marching orders. Says very specifically, go and do likewise. Not just go feel, not just stop and pray, but go act. Go meet the needs of your literal neighbor. I looked at a whole bunch of different commentaries, just trying to explore, refresh, learn more about this passage. But the one I want to share with you today is not a technical or academic one. It's the commentary from Bob Goff himself, which, to be fair, isn't really a commentary. It's just the opening of chapter 3 where he shares Carol's story. And interestingly enough, he is talking about exactly this parable in the beginning to Carol's story. He says this. He says, "It was a lawyer like me who tried to set up Jesus. This lawyer asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was. I think he was looking for a plan, but Jesus told him about his purpose instead. Your purpose, my purpose. I think Jesus said these things because he knew we couldn't love God if we don't love the people that he surrounds us with. There's no school to learn how to love your neighbor, just the house next door. No one expects us to love them flawlessly, but we can love them fearlessly, furiously, and unreasonably. We're not supposed to," here's the opening quote, now it's in its context, "we're not supposed to love only our neighbors, but Jesus thought we should start with them." I bet he knew. If our love isn't going to work for the people who live close to us, then it's probably not going to work for the rest of the world either. This has been God's simple yet brilliant master plan from the beginning. He made a whole world of neighbors. We call it Earth, but God just calls it a really big neighborhood. For the last 22 years, we put on a New Year's Day parade to celebrate our neighbors. That leads into the story of Carol. So, is this unrealistic? Is this too pie in the sky? Is this too utopia? Is this too simple? Or can we change our world? Can we change the world, loving one neighbor at a time? I believe it is possible. It is realistic. One, because Jesus said it, and I just tend to go with whatever he says, whatever his marching orders are. But also because it's already happened once. The strategy that Jesus is laying out before us is really hospitality, right? Which is the root word for hostel and hotel and hospice and hospital. And the history of hospitality is rooted in the Christian faith and worldview. It is linked specifically to Jesus. When you think about the ancient times, there was no concept of this. And out of that era, specifically the Roman era, a couple of the major innovations that are still in place today are, one, the law system, the Roman law system, and two, the Roman roads that revolutionized the way the world connected and traveled, especially in the Mediterranean area. And so this is something that is changing the landscape of the world and culture around. And what Christians do is, based on their command to love one another as Jesus has loved us, they lean into this cultural moment and they take advantage of the opportunity available to them. Priests all over the place were encouraging Christians in their homes to set up what was known as the Christ room, based on the concept that when you welcome a stranger into your home and care for their needs, it's like you're welcoming Jesus into your home. If you have a guest room in your home today, regardless of what it is that you personally believe about Jesus, it's inspired by this practice. And what would quite literally happen is people were going to these new towns and new cities, traveling like never before, and they would ask where the followers of Jesus were, because they knew that that was the free and the safe place to stay. Imagine, not like I'm trying to avoid Christians, the weird Christians, but I want to know where they are. They're the best, the most attractive, the most safe people to stay with. Emperor Julian at the time was just one of the political powers trying to get rid of this. He saw this growing popularity of Christianity. There was a nonviolent movement, so they didn't know how to persecute it or get rid of it. And so as a result, he's like, why don't we just copy them? And there's this famous letter where he writes to his Hellenistic priests, and he said, let's just do what they're doing. We should be able to beat them at it. Except the heart was missing from his movement. They were trying to beat another movement based on love. They weren't inspired by a personal savior from whom people were drawing their inspiration from first, and so it was ineffective. About 8 years after he writes his letter in 370, Bishop Basil the Great, who is known for kind of the first hospital. He is a guy who starts to establish monasteries all around. And I know when we think of monasteries today, we think of something like on the side of a cliff, in New Zealand, separate from the world. And in reality, monasteries in the beginning were cultural centers of communities. They were how the followers of Jesus would expand into new areas and how the kingdom of God would advance, because they would be centers of art, centers of literature. It is where those who were sick and poor and in need would go. All kinds of creativity and inventions would come out of these. The fork interestingly enough. We don't eat with our hands because of a fork invented in monasteries. Breweries, which is really great in Germany, so, great beer thanks to the early monks. But all of these just cultural centers that would be at the base point of the community, and the community would kind of grow out from there. And if there was a practical need of the community, they would go to see monasteries. And this guy in particular is credited with the first hospitals. And for 1,000 years, it was Christians who monitored those. It wasn't until the 1500s that cities in Europe became responsible and took ownership over hospitals. And it wasn't until much more recent history that the federal government became responsible for all kinds of social services. That's not a critique or anything like that. It's just an observation of history that the reason we believe those things are foundational rights today is because followers of Jesus said, I'm going to love my neighbor as he loved me, and it changed the world. And in a time period that's as divided as many of us can ever remember it, where there are more areas of life and culture to create an us versus them mentality than perhaps ever before, what if we leaned into the place that God has planted us to love our neighbor this way? And what could it mean for the part of the world that we live in? What does it mean for you to love your neighbor universally and particularly? Yes, the world, but also your literal neighbor. Or another way we've already kind of worded it, what would it look like for you to love them? Metaphorically, yes. Your posture, your thoughts, your prayer life, yes. And literally to meet their practical needs. What would that look like for you? I want to end our conversation, really our series, the short 2-part series today, with 2.5 ways that you might be able to do that. And you can choose and pick one of them. Well, the halfway I'll start with first. And the halfway is Camp 75, happening this week, starting tomorrow. And I say the halfway for this reason. There's a part of me, I almost didn't include this as an example this week, because our heart behind this series is to say this is something that's more about the other 358 days of the year, that this is foundational. Jesus was so clear, love God, love people. So how is it that our increasing love for Jesus flows into the neighbors that are put around us? That's something that we should be prioritizing every day and every week of the year. And if you're new here to this place, you're looking to plug in and connect here, if you would consider yourself a part of Northpoint, this is the way over the course of the next 7 days that we're putting our time and energy and effort into loving our community in tangible and unexpected ways. That all over our community, in neighborhoods, we're going to have students leading teams at 75-minute camps in the front yards and backyards of host homes. They're going to be bringing Wombaland and Upstreet to our community around us, and kids are going to be inviting their friends to each of those. And if you're looking to host, you're like, I've got a space, I've got a yard, there's some neighborhood kids that would come. It's still not too late to be a location and sign up to host. There are hundreds of drivers that make this logistically possible, morning, evening, some all day. And we always need more drivers because this amazing thing happens throughout the week where walk-ons, that's what we call them, students that were not at boot camp but see what's happening and see all the energy on social media, want to be a part of the movement. So we've got to create more space and more seatbelts for them. We have tangible needs for that still tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening, and it is upon us. So if you're like, do you need me? The answer is yes. Camp75.org, you can sign up for all of that. And a week from now, Summerfest is coming, and next to Christmas and Easter, it's the easiest Sunday of the year to invite. We transformed this whole building, the whole parking lot, so many events for the entire family, and this is a practical, tangible way right now in this moment. And of course, I want you to be a part of it. Of course, I'm passionate about it. And of course, I believe it will not only impact the community that we live in, but it will impact your world as well. And that's the next 7-day window. Beyond that, I really am asking that you do at least one of these next 2 options. So the other one that I want to introduce you to is if you would go and fill out your version of this grid. You can draw this, you can get this on your iPad, you can do a spreadsheet, like however you think will work. And specifically, if you live with people, I would encourage you maybe to do this with everybody you live with your roommates, with your spouse and kids. I think it would be awesome to be a part of this whole thing. And we talked about how last week, only 4% of Americans can name their neighbors, which are the 8 houses closest to us in a grid like this. So a great starting point would be over the next 30 days, can I just write in the names of my neighbors? If I'm going to love them, that's an awesome place to begin. Can I meet them and write their names down? If you want some extra credit, a really awesome thing to do after that, if you already know all the names, is can I write some things that matter to them? Not what are the things I want to matter to them, but what's important to them? What are their felt needs? Maybe you write some things that you could find on social media because you creeped them first, which is no judgment. I would probably do that too. But maybe some things that you could only get by actually having relationship with them. If you've actually shared a meal with them and you know some of the things that they're fighting, they're battling through, what are their anxieties, their concerns, what are their big hopes and dreams, what's exciting them, and write some of those things in that grid. That's one option for you. You could do that one or you could do that one, or maybe this 15-minute brainstorm. And I think you'd be shocked at just putting a timer, on your phone or watch 15 minutes and see how many ideas can I get down of literally loving my neighbor practically. Our message prep team just put some ideas in a list to maybe get your creative brainstorm started, but your apartment complex, your neighborhood, where you live, you're gonna come up with better ideas than us, and some of you already do an amazing job at this, but here's some of the ideas. Meet your neighbors, like we said, that's probably first and foremost if you don't know them yet. Holidays are just this low-hanging fruit opportunity. If you want people to be a part of your Christmas and Thanksgiving, awesome, especially if they don't have a place to go. But there's so many little ones in between that people do not travel for and go places for, and you're like, man, we're just gonna have the biggest, St. Patrick's Day bash this year that everybody's ever seen, and we're the spot for that. It's just an easy opportunity. Life transitions. Somebody's moving to your neighborhood, somebody's moving out of your apartment complex. Life transitions like somebody's having a child, somebody's switching jobs. Each of those moments, change is usually stressful for people, usually painful, and you have an opportunity to meet a practical need. Pools and parks, like I'm not just gonna go and have my kids run around and just escape for a few minutes on my phone, but I'm gonna bring double the snacks and engage with people around me and meet some parents around me. If you're in a neighborhood Facebook page or an apartment Facebook page, maybe start focusing on posting invites rather than complaints. If you've been a complainer in your Facebook page, maybe just change your profile picture and change your nickname and then start fresh. And just be like, man, I'm going to be an approachable, kind of positive force in this page, and I'm just going to be a place where people can come and hang and be a part of. Maybe you have a repetitive night. It's the first Monday of the month. Everybody knows. It's every Wednesday. People know, like, my doors are going to be open, or we're going to be doing this in the backyard, or whatever it is. Sports, really easy opportunity, even if they're the enemy and they're on the other team, and you're like, man, I'm not just going to watch this with my family, but people are going to come over. We're going to be open for that. Common interest. It doesn't need to be unnecessarily painful, right? If you are a runner, start a running group or join the running group that's already in your neighborhood. If it's knitting, make it knitting. If you love wine, do a wine thing. Like whatever it is, it's just like, man, I already am passionate about this. I'm going to allow people to come enjoy this with me. And then I think a background in student ministry has just, taught me deeply the sacredness of free food. And the older I've gotten, the more I've realized it's not just a student thing. It's a human thing, right? You're grilling and, we've got steaks or we've got burgers or whatever, just come over. Like a lot of people are saying yes to that opportunity. Whatever it is for you, make your own list, really write it down. Know that it is going to cost you time you do not have. Yes, absolutely. But we've been so clear, this is foundational. We don't have time for anything else if we're not getting this first. So I'm going to rearrange some things in my calendar. I'm going to make sure I have time available to love my neighbor. Is this going to cost resources? Yes. This is a rearranging of the budget. This is having way more food available for people or whatever that is. If you don't have that right now, we do have time because we all have the same amount of time on our schedules. This is going to come at a cost to us, of course. This is something we're going to get better at over time. This is not just an extroverted thing and an introverted thing, right? Extroverts are great at this, introverts are not. That's not how this works. I'm actually painful. I'm like the worst of that kind of combination because I test extroverted, but then I'm socially awkward. That's really painful. It's tough to love people, but then not know how to engage with them. Growing up, my brother who's 4 years younger than me, he would have to go ask the waiter on the list how long the wait's going to be because I was too scared to, right? But there's something about being in an environment, interacting with people every week. It's like, man, that's something you get more used to. It's something that, you start awkward, but you learn how to engage your neighbor better. You learn to love your neighbor better along the way. However that is, whether you fill out the grid, you make the list, you do both, you sign up for Camp 75 this week, the question is still the same to each of us. What does it look like for you to love your neighbor universally, big picture across the world, and particularly, individually, specifically? What would it look like, not just in your slice of the world, but in your inner world? Could it be that what Bob said is true, that this is not just a plan or a strategy, this is not just one more religious activity, but this is the purpose for which you have actually been created, for which you've actually been designed? And what could happen in your story and the story of those around you as a result, if you're really to make this a habit in your life? I'd love to pray for all of that, everything that's coming this week, if you guys would pray with me. Father, thank you that you are so clear God, we just don't have to be confused. Love you. Let that flow into the people around us as we love them. It's just, you're so specific. We're so grateful for that. And God, we get distracted and so many different things get in the way and the wrong priorities and all that. And I just ask that you would help that sink from our head to our heart, that you would help us not just see this in the theoretical, not just feel some warmer feelings towards people, but really practically show up and love the people that you have put in our story. And it's not an accident that they are. God, would you guide that, even specifically this week? God, as people on the edge of saying yes to hosting, or on the edge of saying yes to driving, God, would you just move us to community, to connection, to impacting people around us? And would it be so obvious, not just this week, but every single day going from this week, that you are for this community, that you're for all people. Father, we love you. We need you for all of this to happen. We can't do it on our own, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Thank you guys so much for hanging. We'll see you next week on Summerfest Sunday.